In Edo, a poor woman alone had only a few ways to survive.
She could scrape by in a rented room, work for almost nothing, or be swallowed by Yoshiwara, the part of the city where poor women were often driven to sell their bodies just to keep living. Haru was 28, unmarried, and trying very hard not to disappear into that world.
By the time this part of her story begins, she was still holding on.
Not safely, not comfortably, just barely.
Before dawn, the nagaya was almost silent.
A dog barked somewhere far away. Thin moonlight slipped through the cracks of the wooden door.
In Haru's small rented room, there was the faint rustle of bedding, then stillness again.
From the other side of the wall came another sound.
A man's low voice. A woman answering softly.
Then a little laughter, warm and private in a place where nothing was ever truly private.
Haru lay awake and listened without moving.
In Edo, the walls of a nagaya were thin, paper, wood, and very little else.
People heard everything. Quarrels,
Coughing, babies crying, water being poured.
The quiet sounds of husbands and wives settling into the night.
For Haru, those sounds were never only background.
They were reminders. Other people belonged somewhere.
Other people had someone waiting on the other side of the room.
She sat up at last and pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders.
The room was cold. The air smelled of old wood, ash, and bedding that had survived too many winters.
She struck flint and lit the land. A weak flame trembled into life.
Then she reached for her sewing box. It had belonged to her mother.
The wood was worn smooth from years of years.
When her mother died, she left behind no money, no property, and no protection.
Only this box, a few needles, some thread, and the skill to keep a woman alive if she used it well enough.
Haru opened the lid and touched the tools inside with the quiet familiarity of ritual.
Mother's needle, she murmured. Another day. That was how her mornings began.
Not with comfort, not with certainty.
But with work, Haru made her living by sewing and mending clothes.
It was careful work, honest work, and badly paid.
A seamstress in Edo could survive by it, but only just.
Rent had to be paid, rice had to be bought.
Lamp oil, miso, radish, tofu. Everything cost money, and money disappeared quickly when a woman had to face every expense alone. That was one of the quiet hardships of being poor and unmarried.
A family could divide labor. One person cooked, another fetched water, another earned. Haru had to do everything herself.
Even a small illness or a slow week could become dangerous. Soon, the temple bell rang across the district, low and heavy. That was the signal for the day to begin. Doors slid open. Footsteps moved through the lane.
Someone coughed. A child cried out and was hushed.
The nagaya woke all at once, as if poverty itself kept strict hours. Haru wrapped her robe tighter and stepped outside. The shared latrine already had a line.
No one complained. In places like this, complaining changed nothing.
The poor lived close because there was no other way to live. The rooms were small, the walls were thin, and privacy was a luxury few could afford. A woman renting even one small room by herself paid dearly for that little bit of independence. At the well, a few women were already drawing water. Buckets knocked softly against stone. Rope creaked. Someone laughed over a bit of gossip.
Morning conversation in a nagaya was never only conversation. It was news, judgment, complaint, and companionship all mixed together.
Omatsu saw Haru first.
"You're up early again."
"So are you," Haru replied. Another woman came over carrying a kimono with a torn sleeve.
Haru took the cloth and examined it.
"Yes. How much?" 50 mon. The woman nodded. It was not much, but small jobs were what kept Haru alive.
Not big commissions, not grand opportunities. Just one torn sleeve, one weak hem, one patched robe after another.
Before the woman could leave, the landlady called out in a voice louder than it needed to be.
Still not married, Haru?
A few heads turned. No one laughed. They didn't need to. The pause itself did enough. That was another part of life for a woman like her. A single woman was never just herself. She was also a question. Some pitied her. Some admired her for managing alone. Some thought she must be unlucky. Others thought there had to be something wrong with her. Most seemed to believe all of those things at once. In Edo, Marriage did not always mean happiness. But it gave a woman a place society understood.
A wife, a widow, a daughter-in-law. Those roles had shape.
An unmarried woman nearing 30, living alone and paying her own rent, stood outside that shape.
People noticed. Omatsu cut in before the silence deepened.
She has work, she said. That matters more.
Haru said nothing. She took the kimono and returned to her room.
Her breakfast was plain: cold rice, natto, a little miso soup, and pickled radish when she could afford it. Hot rice was for households with more money, more fuel, and more hands. For a woman living alone, convenience mattered more than comfort. She ate quietly because there was no one to speak to, and because poor food went down more easily when she did not think too much. Across the lane, she could hear another household eating together.
Bowls touched wood. Someone laughed softly.
A child asked for more soup. Haru kept her eyes on her own meal.
Then she put the bowl aside and began sewing. Morning light slowly entered the room.
Haru bent over the torn sleeve and worked with the patience of someone who knew precision was the difference between surviving and falling behind.
Needle in, thread through, pull tucked.
Again, her fingertips were rough. Tiny cuts marked the skin. Her wrists sometimes stiffened in the cold.
Her eyes tired quickly in poor light, but she kept going.
This was her life, not dramatic.
Not romantic, just thread, fabric, rent, and the need to make each day add up to enough.
Outside, the nagaya carried on around her.
Water buckets scraped wood. Someone scolded a child.
A door opened and shut. Family life pressed in from every side, even when she was alone. That, perhaps, was the hardest part. Not loneliness in the pure sense, but life shared at close range with everything she herself did not have. By late morning, the sleeve was finished.
Haru set it aside and looked down at her hands. Small cuts, sore fingers, a little stiffness in the wrist. The marks of a life built one careful stitch at a time. She ate a small midday meal alone, a rice ball and some pickles.
Across the way, another family was eating together, voices overlapping in the easy way families do.
Haru kept her gaze lowered. In Edo, women like her were not rare.
Many never married at all, but being common did not make the life easier.
A city could be full of solitary women and still offer them very little mercy.
What Haru understood, even if she never said it aloud, was simple enough.
For the poor, respectability was often harder to afford than food.
When she looked around her room again, it seemed smaller in the noonlight.
There was the folded bedding, the lamp, the patched robe, the sewing box.
Nothing in the room lied to her. It showed exactly what her labor had earned.
A little space, a little food.
Another day. This, too, was Edo.
Not only bright markets and crowded bridges.
Not only samurai and merchants.
Not only lanterns glowing in places meant for pleasure.
There was also this world. Narrow rooms, shared wells, cold rice, aching fingers, and women trying to hold themselves above disaster by the strength of their own hands.
By noon, the day was only half gone.
And already Haru had lived through its most familiar truths.
Work came before comfort. Comfort might not come at all, and in Edo, a poor unmarried woman did not simply wake into a morning.
She woke into a test. By early afternoon, Haru had finished the sleeve and set it carefully aside.
The stitches were neat. The cloth lay flat.
If anyone looked at it, they would hardly notice it had ever been torn.
That was the nature of her work.
When done well, it made damage disappear so quietly that no one stopped to think about the skill behind it.
Haru looked down at her fingers.
Tiny cuts marked the tips. One knuckle ached.
The skin along her thumb had thickened from years of pulling thread through cloth.
None of it looked serious. None of it would have interested anyone else.
But it was there all the same, written across her hands in small private injuries.
She reached for her midday meal.
A rice ball, pickles, nothing more. Across the lane, another household was eating together.
Bowls touched wood. A child laughed.
A woman scolded him gently, then laughed too. Haru kept her eyes on her own food and ate slowly.
In a city as crowded as Edo, loneliness rarely meant silence.
More often, it meant hearing everyone else's life from too close a distance.
There came a knock at the door.
Haru rose, expecting another repair.
Instead, she found O'Kane, one of her regular customers from a draper's shop. Okane usually spoke briskly, with the confidence of someone who had enough business to think in straight lines. Today, she would not quite meet Haru's eyes.
"I'm sorry," she said. "I gave the work to someone else."
Haru's hand tightened slightly on the doorframe.
Someone else? She'll do it cheaper.
That was all. Not anger, not insult.
Just the plain logic of poverty.
Cheaper, Okane bowed awkwardly and left before Haru could say much more.
Haru remained in the doorway long after she was gone.
In Edo, skill mattered, but price mattered more whenever money ran short. That was especially true for women's work.
Needlework demanded patience, sharp eyes, and steady fingers, yet people still treated it as something nearly anyone could do.
If a woman charged properly for careful labor, she risked losing the job to someone more desperate.
Haru closed the door. Was she too slow?
Too expensive? Not good enough? The questions came quickly. Once they began, they were hard to stop.
By mid-afternoon, she could no longer bear sitting in the room. So she took a few coins and went out. The streets were busy. Merchants called to passers-by.
Children ran between doorways.
Housewives bargained over vegetables and tofu. Apprentices hurried under loads too big for their shoulders. Edo was full of movement, trade, and noise.
Even the poor lived surrounded by activity.
That was one of the city's strange cruelties. It offered constant proof that life was happening everywhere, and not necessarily for you.
Haru walked without hurrying. She passed stalls selling grilled food she could smell but not buy. She passed shops with cloth finer than anything she owned.
She passed people who seemed to know where they were going and why.
She herself had no real destination. She only wanted to be somewhere other than inside her own thoughts.
At last, she turned toward the bathhouse.
The entrance fee was small, but still enough to make her hesitate.
Then she paid it anyway. On some days, hot water felt less like luxury than medicine.
Inside, steam hung thick in the air.
Water splashed against wood. Women talked as they washed, wrung cloths, scrubbed children, and lowered themselves into the bath.
The whole place smelled of wet wood, soap, and tired bodies easing themselves for a little while.
Haru slipped into the water and let out a slow breath.
Warmth spread through her shoulders. For a moment, her body softened, but not her mind. Nearby, women were talking. Single women have it easy. No husband to answer to.
No children pulling at them all day.
A few laughed. Haru sank a little deeper into the bath.
Easy. People said that because they saw what she did not have and mistook absence for freedom.
No husband, yes. No in-laws, yes.
No children, yes, but also no shared rent, no help when illness came, no witness to worry, no one to notice if the rice jar was nearly empty.
A woman alone answered to fewer people.
She also fell alone. Haru said never.
Silence was often cheaper than trying to explain yourself to people who had already chosen what to believe. When she left the bathhouse, the sky had begun to turn red.
Clouds glowed above the rooftops.
Crows called in the distance. For a moment, the city looked almost beautiful enough to forgive. She kept walking. Instead of returning straight to the nagaya, she went to the yosei.
For ordinary townspeople, the yosei offered one of Edo's simplest pleasures.
A cheap performance, a comic story.
A room full of strangers willing to laugh at the same moment.
It did not solve anything, but sometimes it made the evening easier to bear.
Haru paid and went inside alone.
Oil lamps flickered. The room smelled of old wood, dust, and packed bodies.
Families sat together. Couples leaned close to one another.
Groups of workers laughed too loudly before the performer had even reached the joke.
Haru sat among them and listened.
Now and then she smiled, but the smile never lasted.
That was the trouble with public pleasures when you had no one to share them with. They could distract you for an hour, then return you to yourself even more sharply than before.
When the performance ended, Haru stepped back into the evening crowd. Nearby, a sweet seller was doing brisk business.
A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve until she bought him something.
The child's face brightened at once.
Without thinking much about why, Haru bought one too.
When the boy looked at her curiously, she held it out.
For you. He took it immediately.
Thank you. Then he ran back to his mother.
The moment lasted only seconds.
Still, when it was over, Haru felt the emptiness return more sharply than before.
Sometimes the smallest warmth reminded a person how little of it waited at home.
By the time she turned back toward the nagaya, practical thoughts had returned. Rent, food, lost work, coins disappearing. When she arrived, the landlord was waiting. He said very little. Men like him seldom needed to. Haru took out her purse and counted what remained. 1,200 mon. After rent, only 400 would be left.
She handed over the money. He took it and walked away.
Haru stood there a moment longer before going back inside.
Then she set the remaining coins beside her sewing box and stared at them.
400 month, half the month still ahead. That was how danger often arrived in a poor woman's life.
Not with thunder, not with some grand tragedy. Just a number too small to carry her safely to the next rent day.
The room seemed smaller after that. She should have stayed inside. Instead, after a little while, she went back out again.
The evening had deepened. Lanterns glowed in doorways.
The streets had grown darker, looser, less orderly.
Men moved in small groups. A few already sounded half-drunk.
Women walked more carefully. Then a man's voice called from the side of the road.
"You're Haru, aren't you?" She stopped.
The man was dressed plainly, not poor enough to invite pity, not respectable enough to inspire trust.
He looked like the kind of man who earned money by noticing when other people had run out of choices.
"I know someone looking for young women," he said.
Haru said nothing. Yoshiwara pays well.
The words hung there between them.
Then he added, watching her closely, 1 Rio a month.
That number struck hard. 1 Rio. Far more than she could make repairing sleeves for 50 mon at a time.
Far more than sitting by a weak lamp and hoping the next customer would come before the rice ran out.
In that moment, it did not sound like luxury.
It sounded like relief. The man must have seen something change in her face because his tone softened.
You're still young enough. It would suit you.
Young enough.
As if that were all she was.
He moved on when she did not answer.
He did not need to press harder.
The city itself would do that for him. Rent would press. Hunger would press. Loneliness would press. The sight of other people living a little more easily would press. Haru remained standing still. Every woman in Edo knew the name Yoshiwara.
Men spoke of it with excitement.
Women spoke of it differently.
Sometimes with pity, sometimes with contempt.
Sometimes with a silence that said too much.
From a distance, it looked bright. Silk, lanterns, music, painted beauty.
But poor women knew what brightness often meant. It meant someone, somewhere, was making money from a woman's desperation.
Haru should have gone straight home.
Instead, she walked. Not quickly, not with any clear decision, but step by step until the streets changed, the lantern glow thickened, and she found herself standing before that other world.
Beyond the gate, lights burned warmly.
Music drifted faintly through the air.
Women moved in silk beneath the glow, graceful from a distance, unreal in the way expensive things often seem to the poor.
Haru opened her purse. 400 mon.
Not enough even to enter that world as a guest. And yet if she entered it another way, she might earn in a month what honest labor gave her only in painful fragments.
She looked at the women beyond the gate.
Beautiful, yes, but even from where she stood, their smiles seemed to belong more to the work than to themselves.
For a long moment, Haru did not move.
Then at last she turned away and walked back into the darker streets.
By the time she reached the nagaya, one thought had settled heavily inside her.
The city had stopped asking whether she was tired. It was beginning to ask what she would sell.
Haru returned to her room, but the room did not feel like shelter. It felt small, cold, and far too honest.
She placed the remaining coins beside her sewing box and stared at them in the lamplight. 400 mon, half the month still ahead.
Rice would cost money. Lamp oil would cost money. Work might come, or it might not.
Even a small setback now could push her somewhere she did not want to go.
Through the wall came the sounds of the neighboring room again.
A child fussing. A woman soothing him.
A man speaking softly. Then the ordinary rustle of a family settling into the night.
Haru lowered herself to the floor and ate her supper.
Cold rice, pickles, thin miso. It had almost no taste.
Across the lane, someone laughed. Somewhere farther off, a door slid shut. The whole city seemed to continue living.
Only Haru felt as though she had reached a narrow place, with no good road forward.
One path was the life she already knew.
Hard, respectable, and always one bad month away from collapse.
The other was the path the broker had placed before her.
Yoshiwara, warmer rooms, better food. Money she could not earn with a needle, no matter how long she bent over cloth.
And in return, her body, her name.
The last piece of herself the city had not yet priced out loud.
She looked at her mother's sewing box.
For years it had meant endurance. Her mother had survived by those tools. Haru had done the same, but tonight the box looked smaller than it ever had before, and the city outside looked larger.
1 Rio. The number would not leave her mind.
That was what made places like Yoshiwara so dangerous. They did not tempt women only with pleasure or vanity.
They tempted them with arithmetic.
A woman could resist shame more easily than hunger. She could endure loneliness longer than unpaid rent.
But once survival itself began to look impossible, even ruin could start to sound practical.
Haru hated that thought. She hated it because it was true. Society liked to speak of respectable women and fallen women as though a clear moral line separated them.
But poverty blurred that line every day. Men judged the women in Yoshiwara. The same men lived in a city built to drive poor women there when other work failed.
Haru drew her knees up and pressed her forehead against them.
She had worked. She had saved when she could.
She had done what she was supposed to do.
And still here she was, staring at a handful of coins and thinking about a gate she had once believed belonged to some other kind of woman.
That was the true cruelty of poverty. It did not always force you all at once.
Sometimes it simply narrowed your choices until disgrace began to look like relief. The lamp flickered. Haru lay down, but sleep would not come. The blanket was thin. The room held the cold.
The coins still glinted beside the sewing box.
She turned onto her side and stared at them until tears began to sting her eyes.
At first, she tried to hold them back.
Then she gave up. She covered her mouth with one hand and cried as quietly as she could.
The walls were too thin for grief.
In a nagaya, even sorrow had to be managed carefully, or it became public by morning.
"Mother," she whispered into the dark. No answer came, only the familiar room. The smell of old wood, the weak flame of the lamp, the sewing box near the wall like the last witness to a life that was beginning to feel too heavy for one woman to carry alone. "I've done everything right," she whispered. That was what hurt most, not that life was difficult. She already knew that. What hurt was that she had obeyed every rule of survival she had been given, and still the city had brought her here.
In that moment, Yoshiwara frightened her less than the thought that it might actually work. If it had looked only ugly, she could have turned away easily.
But it promised relief, and relief was hardest to refuse when a person had run out of strength. She imagined herself saying yes. Not dramatically, not with some grand collapse. Just a quiet surrender, a crossing of a gate. Better food, brighter sleeves. Coins in hand instead of fear beside the lamp. Then she imagined waking there, being watched, smiled at, priced. The thought filled her with shame so sharp it made her sit up. "No," she whispered, but even that sounded uncertain. Because refusal had a cost too.
A woman could say no to disgrace in principle.
It was harder to say no when rice was running low and the next rent day was already waiting somewhere ahead.
The night deepened. Far off, a city gate closed.
The lane outside grew quieter.
Haru wiped at her face, but the tears had not really stopped. They had only slowed. Then, just as the room seemed most empty, there came a knock at the door.
Soft, careful. "Haru?" came Omatsu's voice.
"Are you awake?" Haru quickly wiped her face, though her voice still sounded rough.
"Yes." The door opened a little. Omatsu stood there holding a bowl.
"I made too much simmered daikon," she said.
"You'll help me finish it." Warm steam rose from the bowl.
The smell reached Haru before she could answer. Broth, soy, softened radish, a little fried tofu.
Such an ordinary smell,
and yet for 1 second it nearly made her cry all over again.
I'm not very hungry, Haru said.
That's why you should eat. Omatsu stepped inside and set the bowl down near the lamp.
She glanced once at Haru's face, once at the coins on the floor, and asked no questions.
That kindness was greater than questions would have been.
Haru took the bowl in both hands. The heat pressed into her palms.
She tasted the broth. Warm, salted, richer than anything she had made for herself in days.
Aren't you eating properly? Omatsu asked.
Haru shook her head once. Omatsu lowered herself to the floor beside her.
Your work is good, she said after a moment.
Better than most. That doesn't always matter, Haru said quietly.
No, Omatsu replied. It doesn't always.
But it still matters. Haru stared into the bowl.
What if luck doesn't come back?
Omatsu was silent for a moment. Then she reached over and took Haru's hand. It was such a small thing. A neighbor's hand.
Warm, dry, steady. No miracle.
No promise, just contact, just proof that someone had noticed before Haru disappeared beneath her own fear.
No one in a nagaya survives alone, Omatsu said. People talk as if we do. They're wrong.
The words settled deeper than comfort. Because beneath the hunger, beneath the shame, beneath even the fear of Yoshiwara, Haru had been carrying another terror all night.
That if she fell, she would fall invisibly.
That the city would simply close over her and move on.
Omatsu's hand told her that was not entirely true.
Haru lowered her head and cried again, but more quietly now.
Not only from despair, from relief.
When Omatsu finally stood to leave, she paused at the door.
Sleep if you can, she said. If you can't, then work. Morning comes either way. After she was gone, Haru sat a long while with the empty bowl beside her.
The room was still small. The month was still only half over.
The coins had not multiplied. Yoshiwara still existed. The city had not softened, and yet something had changed.
She reached for the sewing box and opened it.
Inside lay her mother's needle, catching the faintest trace of light.
Haru picked it up and held it between her fingers.
Then she drew the cloth closer, threaded the needle, and bent over her work again.
The sound was tiny in the room.
Needle through fabric, thread pulled tight. Almost nothing. And yet it was enough, for that moment, to keep one truth in place. She had not crossed that gate tonight.
She was still here, and Dawn, whether kind or not, would have to find her on this side of it.
When Haru finally slept, it was not peaceful sleep.
It was the kind that came only after the body had exhausted every other way of enduring.
At some point, the needle slipped from her fingers.
At some point, her head lowered beside the lamp.
At some point, the dark simply took her.
Then morning returned. The temple bell rang across the district, low and heavy, just as it always did.
Pale light slipped through the cracks of the wooden door.
Somewhere in the lane, a bucket struck stone.
Somewhere else, a woman called sharply to a child.
Edo had resumed itself without asking whether Haru was ready.
For a moment, she did not move. The bowl Omatsu had brought sat empty beside the lamp.
Her sewing box was still open.
The needle lay near her hand, as if she had fallen asleep holding on to the smallest thing in the room she still trusted.
Nothing had changed. The rent was still gone.
The coins were still few. Yoshiwara had not disappeared in the night.
And yet the morning felt different.
Despair had not vanished. It had simply loosened its grip.
Sometimes that was enough. A person did not always need hope first. Sometimes she needed food, warmth, and one other human being willing to notice that she was slipping.
Haru sat up slowly, washed, folded her bedding, and straightened the room. Poverty gave a person very little control, so people took it where they could. A swept floor, a cleaned bowl, a needle returned to its place.
Such things did not solve anything, but they kept life from falling apart all at once.
Outside, the nagaya was already awake. At the well, Omatsu glanced at her once and said nothing about the night before. She only gave the smallest nod, as if to say,
You are here, and that is enough for now.
Haru gave the same small nod back. Around them, morning carried on.
Women drew water. Someone complained about prices. A child clung sleepily to his mother's sleeve.
The lane sounded just as it had yesterday and the day before.
Life in Edo was like that. It made room for hardship by refusing to pause for it.
Back in her room, Haru forced herself to eat a little breakfast.
Cold rice again. Natto. Thin miso. The same plain meal. The same narrow life.
But it no longer tasted entirely like the feat.
She reached for her work and began sewing.
Needle in, thread through, pull tight.
The motion calmed her. Cloth was simpler than fear.
A torn seam could be repaired.
A sleeve could be strengthened.
Frayed edges could be made useful again. Needlework did not promise safety, but it offered one thing the rest of the city often did not: order. Near mid-morning, footsteps stopped outside her door.
Haru looked up, expecting another small repair.
Instead, a man stood there in decent working clothes, formal enough to belong to a proper house. He bowed slightly. "Are you Haru?" "Yes, I'm from Isaya, the draper's house," he said.
Our master needs a kimono prepared. I was told you have excellent hands.
For a second, she could only stare at him. "Who told you that?" she asked.
Omatsu. The answer landed softly, but heavily.
The man continued. "It is fine work."
"Well paid. 3 ryo. 3 ryo."
The number was so large, it almost made no sense.
Not the broker's kind of money.
Not money tied to surrender. Money for work she could name.
Work she could do with her own hands and still remain herself. Haru lowered her eyes, not from submission, but to steady her breathing.
"I can do it," she said. The man explained the commission, then left.
For a long moment after the door closed, Haru remained seated in silence.
Then she looked at the sewing box. Last night it had seemed small beside the city's hunger.
This morning it looked different.
Not magical, not enough to protect her from every bad season to come.
But still real. Still hers. Still the thing that had carried her this far.
That was the truth people missed when they spoke carelessly about women like Haru.
They liked stories of solitary endurance.
They admired the image of someone surviving by sheer will. But the poor understood better.
No one survived entirely alone.
Not in a nagaya, not in a city.
Not for long. Somewhere, survival always depended on another hand.
Someone passing along work, someone sharing food, someone speaking your name well in the right place.
By afternoon, Haru's room had changed.
Not in size, not in comfort, but in feeling.
She sorted cloth, counted thread.
Checked her tools. Outside, children ran in the lane. Women laughed at the well. A peddler called out from the street.
The same world remained, but now it no longer seemed to be closing over her.
There was still a path left, narrow, uncertain, and easily lost.
But still there. Toward evening, Omatsu passed by again.
Haru stepped out before she could knock.
"A man from Isaya came," Haru said.
Omatsu's face shifted only slightly.
"Did he? He said you recommended me." "You do good work. That's not the same thing."
"No," Omatsu said. "But it helps."
For a moment, Haru did not know how to answer. Gratitude could feel awkward among people who had learned to live without softness.
At last, she bowed her head once. "Thank you." Omatsu brushed the words aside with a small wave, as though they were unnecessary.
But before leaving, she added, "A nagaya holds people up more than they know."
Then she was gone. That night, Haru lit the lamp again.
The same small flame rose in the same dim room. Her supper was still simple. The walls were still thin.
The city was still vast, hungry, and unfair to women like her.
Yoshiwara still stood somewhere beyond the darker streets, bright as ever.
But Haru no longer felt herself leaning toward it.
She sat with the needle in her hand and thought of the women history rarely bothered to remember. Women at wells, women mending cloth.
Women counting coins. Women judged for being unmarried, yet left to carry their lives alone.
Women keeping one another alive in ways no official record thought worth writing down. She belonged to that hidden city. And perhaps that was why her choice mattered. To refuse Yoshiwara was not to win against poverty forever. It was only to say that poverty would not decide everything for her. That her body was not the city's easiest answer to female desperation.
That her hands, however tired, still meant something.
Outside, someone called a child indoors.
Somewhere, a husband returned home.
Somewhere, laughter moved through a room not her own.
Haru heard it all. This time, she did not feel only the ache of exclusion.
She felt something quieter than that. Steadiness. The morning would come again.
Rent would come again. Hardship would come again. So would the bell. So would the cold. So would the city's endless testing of the poor.
But for now, Haru bent over the cloth, and the needle moved steadily in her hand.
It was not a grand victory. It was something smaller, and perhaps more true.
In a city that offered poor women many ways to disappear.
Haru had chosen to remain herself,